I'm Victoria Mitchell, 34, a career military intelligence analyst who spent 15 years serving in silence. At my younger sister's wedding, they seated me in the back row, the family embarrassment. The one who never amounted to anything. My mother's dismissive glance cut deeper than any battlefield wound I'd endured. But when the ceremony was interrupted by three-starred uniforms walking down that aisle, searching the crowd until their eyes found mine, everything changed. The family that had written me off was about to discover exactly who I really was, and what I'd sacrificed to keep them all safe. Sometimes the greatest victories come dressed in dress blues, and sometimes justice arrives precisely when you need it most. The parking lot of St. Mary's Cathedral buzzed with the controlled chaos of a society wedding. I smoothed my navy dress, the one I'd worn to 3 other weddings this year, and checked my reflection in the car window. Presentable, but not memorable. Just how I'd trained myself to be. The usher, a college friend of Emma's, barely glanced at my invitation before directing me with a polite smile toward the back of the cathedral. "Right this way, miss." His tone was pleasant but dismissive, the kind reserved for distant relatives and plus ones nobody really knows. I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking against the marble floor, past rows of perfectly dressed guests. The front rows gleamed with Emma's medical school colleagues, their designer suits and confident postures speaking of success and importance. Behind them sat our parents' friends, the country club set who'd watched Emma grow from precocious child to accomplished surgeon. My assigned seat was in the 8th row, squeezed between Great-Aunt Margaret, who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years, and a family friend whose name I'd forgotten. The handwritten place card read, "Simply Victoria Mitchell, no +1, no special designation, just another obligation fulfilled." "Victoria," dear Aunt Margaret whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her lavender perfume. I heard, "You're still working at that little government job. Still single, I suppose?" I nodded, offering the practiced smile I'd perfected over years of deflecting questions. "Still enjoying the work?" I said, which was true enough. Saving lives and protecting national security did have its rewards, even if I couldn't share them. From my vantage point, I could see Mother near the front, radiant in her champagne silk dress, greeting guests with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of social navigation. When her eyes found mine across the crowded cathedral, her smile faltered slightly, just enough for me to catch the disappointment she'd never quite learned to hide. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the assembled guests. Everyone looked prosperous, accomplished, worthy of their proximity to the altar. And there I sat, the family's quiet disappointment, the daughter who'd somehow failed to launch despite every advantage. If only they knew the weight of the secure phone in my purse, still active even on my sister's wedding day. If only they understood that my little government job had prevented 3 terrorist attacks in the past year alone. But that was the burden I'd chosen to carry, letting them think less of me to keep them safe. The murmur of conversation around me felt like a constant hum of judgment. I pulled the small framed photo from my Wallita picture of myself in dress blues for my promotion ceremony 3 years ago. The ceremony no family member had attended because they didn't even know it existed. I always wondered what happened to Victoria. I heard cousin Patricia whisper to her husband 2 rows ahead. She was so bright in high school. Valedictorian, wasn't she? Such a shame she never did anything with it. Her husband's response was barely audible. Some people just peak early, I guess. Emma was always the driven one. I tucked the photo back into my wallet, my fingers brushing against the classified identification card I could never show them. The irony wasn't lost on me here. I sat, surrounded by people discussing my wasted potential while carrying credentials that would make most of them speechless. My mind drifted to the conversation I'd overheard between my parents last month when I'd stopped by their house. Dad had been in his study, door slightly ajar, talking to someone on the phone. "Emma's making a real difference in the world," he'd said with unmistakable pride. "Saving lives every day. Victoria, well, she's found her level, I suppose. Not everyone can be exceptional." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound I'd sustained in the field. I'd stood there in the hallway holding the birthday gift I'd brought him, listening to my father dismiss 15 years of service to my country as settling for mediocrity. That night, I'd returned to my apartment and stared at the commendation letters locked in my safe. Letters from generals, from the president himself, thanking me for operations that had saved thousands of lives. Operations my family would never know about. The sacrifice had seemed worth it then. Every mission required someone willing to disappear into the shadows to let others take credit, to remain invisible. I'd volunteered for that role, not just professionally, but personally. My family's safety had always been paramount, even if it meant their respect was the price I paid. Great Aunt Margaret shifted beside me, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. Emma's always been the responsible one. Remember when Victoria dropped out of that PhD program? Such a waste of intelligence. What she didn't know was that I'd left graduate school the day I was recruited for my first classified assignment. The mission that had prevented a dirty bomb from detonating in downtown Chicago. The mission that had required me to disappear from my old life entirely. I closed my eyes and let the familiar weight of secrecy settle over me. In 30 minutes, Emma would walk down this aisle in her grandmother's wedding dress, surrounded by love and admiration, and I would watch from the back, carrying secrets that kept her world safe. Accepting the role I'd chosen as the family's forgotten daughter, the organ's first notes filled the cathedral with majestic sound, and the assembled guests rose as one. I stood with them, smoothing my dress and adjusting my small purse, the one containing equipment that could coordinate international intelligence operations, though no one here would ever suspect it. The wedding program in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Emma's name was elegantly scripted across the cover, with David's beside it in matching calligraphy. Inside, the wedding party was listed in careful detail: bridesmaids, groomsmen, parents, grandparents. My name appeared once in small print under family, without any special designation or role. The processional began with Emma's college roommate, radiant in dusty rose silk. She was followed by Emma's medical school friends, each one accomplished and confident. I watched them glide down the aisle, their futures bright and uncomplicated, their successes something they could share with pride. Then came David's family's successful attorneys and business owners, people whose achievements were displayed in corner offices and newspaper clippings. They walked with the quiet confidence of those who'd never had to hide their accomplishments or downplay their worth. Father appeared at the cathedral entrance, distinguished in his black tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled. Beside him, Emma was breathtaking in grandmother's vintage lace dress, her smile luminous with happiness. The sight of them together, father and daughter, pride and accomplishment, created a picture-perfect moment that made my chest tight with emotion. As they processed down the aisle, I caught glimpses of their faces. Father's expression was one of pure joy, the look of a man presenting his greatest achievement to the world. Emma glowed with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the family hierarchy, never questioned whether she was worthy of love and respect. They paused at the altar, and Father lifted Emma's veil to kiss her cheek. The gesture was tender, public, celebrated by 200 guests who witnessed this moment of paternal pride. I thought of my own accomplishments, the medals locked in my safe, the lives saved, the threats neutralized, and wondered what it would feel like to have my father look at me that way. The ceremony began with traditional words about love, commitment, and family. From my position in the back, I could see the joy on Mother's face as she watched her younger daughter marry a successful pediatric surgeon. This was the kind of wedding she'd always envisioned. Respectable, prestigious, worthy of the family name. But even as I watched Emma's happiness, I felt the familiar vibration of my secure phone. A message that would normally send me into immediate action. Today, I simply noted it and returned my attention to the ceremony, knowing that other agents were handling whatever crisis had emerged. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of vehicles, arriving more than seemed necessary for a wedding of this size, but I was focused on my sister's radiant smile, on this moment of pure joy that my work had helped protect, even if no one would ever know it. The secure phone in my purse buzzed again, a pattern I recognized immediately. Priority Alpha communication, kind that usually meant lives were at stake. I discreetly checked the message, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the encrypted keyboard. Operation Nightingale complete. Secondary targets neutralized. Awaiting your confirmation. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. Operation Nightingale teen, months of deep cover work to infiltrate a terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on medical facilities across the Midwest. Emma's hospital had been target number 3 on their list. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to the day I'd walked away from everything that made sense to my family. I'd been 22, fresh out of college with a full scholarship to MIT's PhD program in international relations. My parents had been so proud already, planning how they'd introduce me as Dr. Sarah Mitchell at social gatherings. Then came the knock on my dorm room door. 2 men in dark suits with badges that opened doors I'd never imagined existed. They'd seen my thesis on Middle Eastern political structures, my language proficiency scores, my psychological evaluation results. They offered me something no graduate program could, the chance to serve my country in ways that mattered more than any academic achievement. The recruitment process had been intensive. Months of testing, training, psychological evaluation. They'd explained the cost, a life lived in shadows, achievements that could never be celebrated. A family that would eventually see me as a failure because I could never tell them the truth. I accepted without hesitation. The first assignment had been in Afghanistan, embedded with a unit tracking weapons smugglers. I'd spent 8 months in the desert, my official cover story claiming I was working as a low-level State Department clerk. Meanwhile, I was coordinating intelligence operations that prevented IEDs from reaching American convoys when I'd returned home. Gaunt and exhausted, my parents had assumed I'd been struggling with a dead-end government job. Mother had made pointed comments about wasted potential. Father had started introducing me as our Sarah, still trying to find her way. The second assignment had been Domestica white supremacist group, planning to bomb a synagogue in Detroit. I'd spent 6 months infiltrating their network, attending meetings, building trust, gathering intelligence. The operation had been a complete success, but the official report listed me as Agent S7, not Sarah Mitchell. Each mission had required me to become someone else, to suppress my real identity further. The Syrian arms dealer who'd trusted me with shipping schedules, the domestic terrorist who'd confided his plans to attack a children's hospital, the foreign intelligence operative who'd tried to recruit me. Not knowing I was already playing a deeper game between assignments, I'd return home to a family that saw me as increasingly directionless. They'd attributed my frequent absences to travel for work, never imagining that my work involved preventing the kind of catastrophes that made headlines. The hardest part hadn't been the danger or the isolation. It had been sitting at family dinners, listening to Emma describe her residency rotations while I ate in silence. Unable to share that I'd just returned from preventing a biological weapons attack that would have killed thousands, my secure phone buzzed again. This time it was a commendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff for my role in Operation Nightingale. The message included a phrase that made my throat tight. "Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels." I looked around the cathedral, at my family, at the guests who saw me as the Mitchell daughter who'd never quite succeeded. If only they knew that their safety, their ability to gather in peaceful celebration, had been purchased with my anonymity. The memory hit me like a physical blow. The moment I'd realized that protecting my family meant sacrificing their respect forever. It had been 2 years ago during Operation Blackout, when I'd discovered that Emma's hospital was being surveilled by a domestic terrorist group. I'd been deep undercover for 8 months, living in a rundown apartment, working as a night shift security guard at a warehouse that served as a front for arms dealing. My cover identity was Victoria Williams, a college dropout with a history of failed relationships and dead-end jobs. It was the kind of persona that made me invisible, forgettable. What the mission required. The breakthrough had come during a late-night conversation with Marcus, the group's leader. He'd been drinking, talking about targets that would send a message to the medical establishment. When he'd mentioned Emma's hospital by name, describing the layout of the emergency room where she worked, my blood had turned cold. "That bleeding heart doctor, Emma Mitchell," he'd said, his voice slurred with alcohol and hatred. "She treats everyone who comes through those doors, no questions asked. Makes her a perfect target for proving our point." I'd forced myself to remain calm, to nod in agreement, to ask casual questions about timing and methods. Inside, I was screaming. My little sister, who'd chosen medicine because she wanted to heal people, was being targeted by monsters who saw her compassion as weakness. That night, I'd sat in my grimy apartment staring at my secure phone, knowing that one call could end the operation and save Emma immediately, but it would also alert the cell to law enforcement surveillance, allowing them to disappear and strike elsewhere. The intelligence we'd gathered suggested they had at least 12 other targets, including schools and shopping centers. I'd made the hardest decision of my life. I'd stayed undercover for 3 more months. I'd lived with the knowledge that my sister was in danger while I gathered the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. I'd attended their planning meetings, helped them case targets, even drove reconnaissance missions past Emma's hospital. Every day I'd prayed that my fellow agents could keep her safe without compromising the operation. The night of the planned attack, I'd been the one to signal the strike team. I'd watched from inside the warehouse as FBI agents arrested Marcus and his associates, their weapons and explosives secured before anyone could be hurt. The operation had been a complete success. 17 arrests, multiple plots foiled, dozens of lives saved, but I'd never been able to tell Emma that she'd been in danger. Never been able to explain why I'd seemed distant during those months, why I'd missed her birthday dinner, why I'd made excuses to avoid family gatherings. She'd attributed my behavior to another phase of my mysterious government job. Never. Suspecting that her life had hung in the balance, the declassified report, the one locked in my safe at home, detailed how Operation Blackout had prevented what would have been the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in a decade. It mentioned the courage of Agent S7, who had maintained deep cover despite personal connections to potential targets. Agent S7. Not Sarah Mitchell, devoted sister. Not the woman who'd risked everything to keep Emma safe. Just another anonymous operative in a war most people never knew was being fought. I'd received the Presidential Medal of Valor for that operation, presented in a classified ceremony with no family present. The medal sat in my safe next to the others, beautiful and meaningless because the only people whose pride mattered could never know they existed. As I sat in the cathedral watching Emma's wedding, I wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it. Had I saved lives? Yes. Had I protected my family? Absolutely. But the cost had been their love, their respect, their understanding of who I really was. The weight of mother's disappointment had been a constant companion for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to live without it. I could trace the exact moment it had begun: my college graduation. The last time she'd looked at me with unqualified pride, I'd been summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, headed for MIT with a full scholarship. Mother had worn her best dress to graduation, her smile radiant as she'd posed for photos with her accomplished daughter. In that moment, I'd been everything she'd hoped for: intelligent, successful, worthy of the Mitchell name. The photo from that day was still displayed in their living room, but it felt like a monument to a different person. The Victoria in that picture had no idea that within 3 months she'd be walking away from everything that made her parents proud. She had such potential. I'd overheard Mother saying to Mrs. Henderson from down the street just last week, "Full scholarship to MIT, you know? We thought she'd become a professor, maybe work in foreign policy. Instead, she's been stuck in some dead-end government job for 15 years. The conversation had taken place at the country club where Mother played bridge every Tuesday with the same group of women who'd watched their children grow up together. These women knew about Emma's medical achievements, could recite her accomplishments from memory. About me, they knew only that I'd somehow disappointed my mother's expectations. Emma's always been the focused one. Mother had continued, her voice carrying the weight of years of comparison. She knew she wanted to be a doctor from the time she was 12. Victoria, well, she seems to drift from one thing to another. Never quite settles down, never quite commits to anything meaningful. If only she knew about the times I'd gone months without contact, deep undercover in situations where one wrong word could mean death. If only she understood that my inability to settle down was because I'd committed myself to something larger than any normal career could offer. The irony was that Mother had always valued service. She'd volunteered at the hospital auxiliary for 20 years, served on the library board, organized charity galas. She understood sacrifice for a greater good, but she could never know that her daughter had taken those values and applied them on a scale she couldn't imagine. I remembered the last time I'd tried to bridge the gap between us. It had been Christmas 2 years ago, and I'd been recovering from a mission that had left me with a scar across my shoulder blade. Mother had noticed me wincing when I'd reached for something on a high shelf. "Victoria, you really should exercise more," she'd said, her tone gentle but critical. "You're not getting any younger, and you seem so tired lately. Maybe if you found work that challenged you more, you'd feel better about yourself." I'd wanted to tell her that I'd been tired because I'd spent the previous month infiltrating a human trafficking ring, that the scar was from a knife fight with a man who'd been selling children. I'd wanted to explain that my work challenged me in ways that pushed me to my physical and emotional limits every single day. Instead, I'd smiled and promised to look into gym memberships. The distance between us had grown wider over the years, filled with her disappointment and my inability to explain myself. Every family gathering became an exercise in deflection. Every conversation, a careful dance around the truth of my life. Mother had stopped asking about my work after the first few years. She'd stopped introducing me with pride, stopped mentioning my achievements because she believed there were none worth sharing. I'd become the daughter she loved but couldn't quite respect. The one who'd had every advantage but somehow failed to thrive. As I sat in the cathedral watching her beam with pride at Emma's wedding, I wondered what she'd think if she knew the truth. Would she be proud of the woman I'd become? Or would she mourn the conventional life I'd given up to serve something greater than myself? Emma's success had always been the standard by which my failures were measured. Her medical diploma, framed in gold and displayed prominently in my parents' living room, represented everything I was supposed to be but had never become Dr. Emma Mitchell, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Catherine's Hospital. The title rolled off my parents' tongues with practiced pride, introduced at every social gathering, mentioned in every conversation about their children. She'd earned it through years of dedication, grueling residency hours, and genuine brilliance. What they didn't know was that I'd helped save her life at least 3 times. The first time had been during her residency, when a patient she'd treated had been connected to a drug cartel I'd been investigating. The cartel had identified her as a potential witness to a shooting victim's injuries, planning to eliminate her to protect their operation. I'd spent 2 weeks coordinating her protection while maintaining my cover, ensuring she never knew she was in danger. The second time had been during the hospital shooting 3 years ago. The media had reported it as the work of a lone gunman, but I'd known the truth. It had been a coordinated attack by a domestic terrorist group targeting medical professionals. I'd been part of the team that had prevented the secondary explosions, the ones that would have brought down the entire emergency wing where Emma worked. The third time had been Operation Blackout, when she'd been specifically targeted because of her reputation for treating patients regardless of their background. I'd spent months in that cell listening to them plan her murder, knowing that one wrong move on my part could cost her everything. But Emma knew none of this. To her, I was simply the older sister who'd somehow lost her way, who worked a mysterious government job that paid poorly and offered no prestige. She'd never understood why I'd turned down the MIT scholarship, why I'd chosen a path that seemed to lead nowhere. I worry about Victoria sometimes. I'd overheard her telling David last month when I'd stopped by their apartment. She's so smart, but she seems stuck. I keep hoping she finds something that makes her happy, something that uses her potential. Her concern had been genuine, loving, and completely misguided. She'd wanted to help me, to introduce me to colleagues who might offer better opportunities, to include me in social events where I might meet someone who could advance my career. Every gesture had been an act of love, and every one had been impossible to accept. The truth was, Emma's success had been built on foundations I'd helped secure. Her hospital's safety protocols, the security systems that kept her patients safe, the intelligence networks that prevented attacks on medical facilities. I've been involved in establishing or maintaining most of them during her chief residency. When she'd been working 18-hour days and sleeping in hospital break rooms, I'd been coordinating security for a visit from a foreign diplomat whose medical treatment required absolute discretion. Emma had been the surgeon who'd saved his life, never knowing that the enhanced security measures had been my recommendation. When she'd been awarded her current position, the decision had been influenced by a safety assessment I'd conducted showing that her leadership style and crisis management skills made her uniquely qualified to handle the security challenges facing modern hospitals. She'd earned the job through her own merit, but I'd helped create the criteria that recognized her strengths. The irony was that Emma and I had chosen similar paths. We'd both dedicated our lives to protecting others, to serving something greater than ourselves. The difference was that her service was celebrated while mine remained invisible. I loved watching her succeed, genuinely took pride in her accomplishments. But every award she received, every recognition she earned, served as a reminder of the recognition I'd never receive. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because the nature of my work required me to remain in the shadows. As I sat in the cathedral, watching my successful sister marry her successful husband, I wondered what our relationship might have been like if I'd been free to share my real life with her. Would she have been proud of my work? Would she have understood the sacrifices I'd made? Instead, I was the sister who worried her, the one who seemed to drift through life without purpose or achievement. It was a burden I carried willingly, but it was still a burden. The annual Mitchell family newsletter had become a particular source of pain over the years. Every December, Mother would compile a cheerful summary of family achievements, distributed to relatives and family friends across the country. Emma's accomplishments filled half a page each year, while my section had gradually shrunk to a single line. Victoria continues her work with the government. Uncle Robert, seated 2 rows ahead of me, turned slightly in his pew and caught my eye. His expression was a mixture of pity and disapproval, the look of someone who'd watched a promising young person waste their potential. He'd been asking the same questions for 15 years, and I'd been giving the same vague answers. Still working for the government, Victoria? He'd asked at last year's Christmas gathering. What department was that again? Administrative services? I'd replied, using the cover story I'd memorized years ago. Nothing very exciting. He'd nodded with the dismissive air of someone who'd written me off long ago. Well, I suppose someone has to do the paperwork. The extended family had stopped expecting great things from me. Sometime around my 8th year of service, at first they'd assumed I was climbing the ladder in some federal agency, working my way toward a position worthy of my education. When no promotions materialized, when my job description remained deliberately vague, they'd begun to treat me as the family's cautionary tale. Aunt Helen had been the most vocal about her disappointment. Victoria had such promise, she'd said to my mother within my hearing. Full scholarship to MIT, you know. We all thought she'd become someone important. Maybe work in the State Department or become a professor. Instead, she's been filing papers. For 15 years, the judgment in her voice had been unmistakable. In her world, worth was measured by titles, salaries, and social recognition. A woman approaching 40 with no husband, no impressive job title, and no apparent ambitions was someone to be pitied. Cousin Patricia had been more direct. "Don't you want more than this, Victoria?" she'd asked during last summer's family reunion. "You're so bright, so capable. Surely you could find something better than whatever you're doing now." The question had haunted me for months. Did I want more? In the conventional sense, perhaps. I'd occasionally wondered what it would be like to have a career I could discuss at dinner parties, achievements I could share with pride, a life that made sense to the people who loved me. But then I'd remember the faces of the people I'd saved, the disasters I'd prevented, the evil I'd helped thwart. I'd think about the terrorist attacks that had never happened, the weapons that had never reached their targets, the innocent lives that continued because of work I'd done in shadows. The truth was that I had more than most people could imagine. I had the satisfaction of knowing that my work mattered on a scale that dwarfed most conventional careers. I had the trust of the highest levels of government, the respect of colleagues who understood the stakes we faced, the knowledge that I was making a difference in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, but I also had the burden of watching my family see me as a failure, of sitting at gatherings where my life was discussed in pitying whispers, of being the daughter who'd somehow disappointed everyone who'd once believed in her potential. Great Aunt Margaret shifted beside me, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. "I keep hoping Victoria will find herself," she murmured to her companion. "She's getting to the age where these things become more difficult to change. Find myself." The phrase would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. I'd found myself years ago in service to something larger than personal ambition. I'd found purpose, meaning, and a calling that used every skill I possessed. I'd found a life of significance that most people could only dream of. I'd just never been able to share it with the people whose opinions mattered most to me. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the cathedral's stone walls, unnaturally sharp against the gentle organ music. I felt the familiar tingle of awareness that came with years of training, the subtle shift in atmosphere that suggested something significant was about to happen. Father McKenna's voice faltered slightly as he spoke about the bonds of marriage, his attention drawn to the unusual activity visible through the cathedral's tall windows. Several guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening outside. Then the massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral swung open with a resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations. The afternoon light streamed in, silhouetting 3 figures in dress blue uniforms. The guests nearest the entrance gasped audibly, their murmurs rippling through the assembled crowd like water disturbed by stones. General Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stepped into the cathedral first. Her silver hair was perfectly styled beneath her service cap, her uniform immaculate, her bearing unmistakably authoritative. Behind her followed General Marcus Thompson, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Sarah Chen, Chief of Naval Operations. Their combined presence represented the highest levels of military command in the United States. The wedding ceremony came to a stuttering halt as 200 guests turned to stare at the unexpected arrivals. Emma's face went pale with confusion while David looked as though he might faint. Mother's expression shifted from bewilderment to barely concealed panic. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated perfect wedding. "Father." McKenna cleared his throat uncertainly. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could, please continue with the ceremony," General Hayes said, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral without seeming raise. "We're here on official business, but we don't wish to interrupt this beautiful celebration." The 3 officers began walking down the center aisle with measured steps, their polished shoes clicking against the marble in perfect synchronization. The guests parted slightly, creating a pathway while staring in stunned silence at the unprecedented display of military authority. I felt my heart begin to race as I realized where they were heading. Their eyes were scanning the crowd methodically, professionally, until General Hayes' gaze locked onto mine. The recognition in her expression was unmistakable. She knew exactly who she was looking for. Uncle Robert's mouth fell open as the procession passed his row. Aunt Helen clutched her purse to her chest as though the officers might somehow threaten her. Great Aunt Margaret beside me whispered, "What on earth is happening?" The Joint Chiefs stopped directly in front of my row, their combined presence creating a barrier that separated me from the rest of the wedding guests. General Hayes stepped forward, her expression grave but respectful. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cathedral, "would you please stand?" The words hit me like a physical blow. 15 years of anonymity, of careful invisibility, of being the family member who didn't matter, all of it was about to end in the most public way possible. I rose, slowly, my legs unsteady, aware that every eye in the cathedral was now focused. On me, Mother's face had gone completely white. Emma was gripping David's arm so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Father looked as though he was witnessing something that couldn't possibly be real. Victoria Elizabeth Mitchell, General Hayes, continued her voice, formal but warm. By order of the President of the United States and in recognition of your 15 years of distinguished service to this nation, you are hereby summoned to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The silence that followed was so complete. It seemed to have weight. Then, slowly, the implications of what they'd just heard began to dawn on the assembled guests. The family's failure, the daughter who'd never amounted to anything, was being honored by the highest military officials in the country. The woman they'd pitied was about to receive the nation's highest civilian honor. General Hayes reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio that seemed to glow with official importance. The presidential seal was embossed in gold on the cover, and when she opened it, I caught a glimpse of heavy parchment and formal seals. "The President of the United States," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the highest office in the land, "has directed me to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of your extraordinary service to the national security of the United States." She began to read from the citation, her words echoing through the cathedral with stunning clarity. "For 15 years of distinguished service in the field of international intelligence, during which time Agent Victoria Elizabeth Mitchell has conducted operations of the highest classification, prevented multiple terrorist attacks on American soil and saved countless innocent lives through her courage, dedication, and sacrifice." The gasps from the congregation were audible now. I could see Mother's face in my peripheral vision, her expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Agent Mitchell has operated under deep cover in environments of extreme danger." The general continued, infiltrating terrorist organizations, disrupting weapons, trafficking networks, and providing intelligence that has prevented attacks on schools, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure throughout the United States. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with realization. She was beginning to understand that her hospital, her patients, her very life had been protected by the sister she'd worried about for years. Her most recent operation, designated Operation Nightingale, resulted in the disruption of a domestic terrorist network that had planned coordinated attacks on medical facilities across the Midwest. Agent Mitchell's 18-month deep cover assignment led to the arrest of 17 individuals and the prevention of what intelligence analysts estimate would have been the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in modern American history. The words hit the congregation like physical blows. These people who'd spent years pitying my lack of ambition were learning that I'd been living a life of service and sacrifice that most could barely comprehend. Admiral Chen stepped forward, carrying a velvet box that contained the actual medal. "Agent Mitchell's personal sacrifice has been extraordinary," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "She has foregone recognition, advancement, and personal relationships to maintain the deep cover necessary for her assignments. Her family was never informed of her true work, as her effectiveness depended on her ability to appear unremarkable and unsuccessful. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their dismissal of me had been essential to my success. Every disappointed look, every pitying comment, every assumption about my failure had been a crucial part of my cover." General Thompson, who had remained silent until now, spoke with quiet authority. "The intelligence community has few agents capable of the long-term sacrifice required for Agent Mitchell's type of work. Her willingness to accept personal and family misunderstanding in service to her country represents the highest ideals of American service." I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes, not from the recognition but from the sudden understanding that my family was finally learning the truth. The truth about why I'd been absent, why I'd seemed directionless, why I'd never been able to share my real life with them. "Agent Mitchell," General Hayes said, looking directly into my eyes, "your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Your service has been exemplary, your sacrifice profound, and your results extraordinary. It is my honor to present you with this recognition on behalf of a grateful nation." The medal itself was beautiful, a white star suspended from a blue ribbon, the presidential seal gleaming in gold at its center. As Admiral Chen lifted it from the box, the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to catch every facet, creating a moment of almost ethereal beauty. Father McKenna, who had been standing frozen at the altar throughout this unprecedented interruption, seemed to find his voice. "Perhaps," he said softly, "we might pause the ceremony to properly honor Agent Mitchell's service." General Hayes nodded respectfully. "That would be most appropriate, Father." The cathedral fell into complete silence as the three highest-ranking Military officers in the United States formally recognized 15 years of classified service. The weight of the moment was overwhelming not just for me, but for every person in that sacred space who was witnessing the revelation of a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about the woman they'd pitied for so long. The silence that followed the medal presentation was broken by a sound I'd never expected to hear in this context: my mother's quiet sobbing. I turned to see her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding finally lifting. Father was staring at me as though seeing me for the first time, his expression cycling through shock, pride, and what looked like grief for all the conversations we'd never been able to have. The man who'd dismissed my achievements because he'd never known they existed was confronting the reality that his daughter had been serving at the highest levels of national security. Emma had gone completely pale, her medical training apparently insufficient to process the emotional trauma of learning that her unsuccessful sister had been protecting her life for years. David was supporting her weight as she swayed slightly, the full implications of what she'd just heard beginning to sink in. Uncle Robert, who'd made a career of questioning my choices, looked as though he might be sick. The nephew-in-law who'd patronized me at every family gathering was realizing that the woman he'd pitied had been operating at levels of responsibility he couldn't comprehend. General Hayes had stepped back to allow the family a moment to process, but her presence remained commanding. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said gently, addressing my mother, "your daughter's sacrifice has been extraordinary. The intelligence community rarely sees agents willing to maintain deep cover for such extended periods, especially when it requires accepting misunderstanding from the people they love most." Mother looked up, her eyes red with tears, but clear with understanding. "She let us think," her voice broke. "She let us think she was failing because her work required it." "Yes, ma'am," Admiral Chen confirmed. Agent Mitchell's effectiveness depended entirely on her ability to appear unremarkable. Your family's perception of her as unsuccessful was actually crucial to her operational security. The words hung in the air like an indictment of every disappointed look, every pitying comment, every assumption about my lack of direction. My family was confronting the reality that their dismissal of me had been not just wrong, but unknowingly essential to keeping them safe. Emma found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "The hospital, you said there were threats to medical facilities." General Thompson nodded gravely. St. Catherine's Hospital was specifically targeted in multiple operations. Agent Mitchell's work prevented attacks that would have resulted in significant casualties among both patients and medical staff. "My God," Emma breathed, her hand going to her throat. "All this time, I thought you were." She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the assumptions she'd made about my life and choices. Great-aunt Margaret, who'd spent years lamenting my wasted potential, was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "We never knew," she said, her voice small and ashamed. "We never had any idea." "That was the point," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the officers had arrived. "You weren't supposed to know. Your safety depended on you never." Knowing the weight of that truth settled over the cathedral like a blanket. These people who'd loved me despite what they perceived as my failures were learning that their love had been tested by an illusion I'd carefully maintained to protect them. Father stepped forward, his face etched with emotion. "Victoria," he said, his voice breaking on my name, "I'm so sorry. We had no idea what you were sacrificing for us." The apology hung between us. 15 years of misunderstanding, distilled into 4 simple words that couldn't begin to address the complexity of what we'd all lost and gained through my deception. "General." Hayes reached into her portfolio again, withdrawing a thick document marked with security classifications. "With the President's authorization," she said, "I'm permitted to share certain declassified details about Agent Mitchell's service, particularly as it relates to threats against your family and community." She opened the document, revealing pages of redacted text with enough visible information to paint a terrifying picture. Operation Blackout, completed 18 months ago, involved Agent Mitchell infiltrating a domestic terrorist cell that had compiled detailed intelligence on medical facilities across 7 states. Emma's face went ashen as the general continued. St. Catherine's Hospital was designated as Target Alpha in their operational planning. The cell had detailed floor plans of the emergency department, shift schedules for medical staff, and specific intelligence about Dr. Emma Mitchell's routine. The words hit Emma like physical blows. She sank back into the pew, David's supporting arm the only thing keeping her upright. The successful surgeon who'd spent years worrying about her unsuccessful sister was learning that her very survival had depended on that sister's skill and sacrifice. "They had photos," General Hayes continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "Surveillance images of Dr. Mitchell arriving at work, leaving the hospital, stopping for coffee. Agent Mitchell spent 8 months embedded with this group. gathering intelligence while watching them plan her sister's murder. Mother's sobbing intensified, the sound echoing through the cathedral like a prayer of grief and gratitude. The woman, who'd spent years disappointed in one daughter, was confronting the reality that she owed that daughter's life to the other. The planned attack would have involved explosive devices in the emergency department during the evening shift change, the general explained. Casualty estimates suggested hundreds of deaths, with medical personnel specifically targeted to maximize psychological impact. Father's face had gone completely gray. "She knew?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Victoria knew Emma was in danger and couldn't tell us. Agent Mitchell's position required her to maintain operational security at all costs." Admiral Chen confirmed. She couldn't risk compromising the investigation, even when it meant watching her family remain unknowingly in danger. The moral complexity of that choice settled over the assembled guests like a weight. The sister they'd seen as directionless had been carrying the burden of their survival while accepting their disappointment as the price of their protection. The night of the raid, General Thompson continued. Agent Mitchell provided the signal. That allowed federal agents to arrest 17 members of the cell simultaneously. Weapons, explosives, and detailed attack plans were recovered. The operation prevented what intelligence analysts believe would have been the deadliest domestic terrorist attack since September 11. Uncle Robert, who'd spent years questioning my government work, looked as though he might collapse. "We owe our lives to her," he said, his voice thick with shame and gratitude. "The entire community owes their lives to her," General Hayes corrected. Agent Mitchell's work has prevented attacks on 3 schools, 2 shopping centers, a synagogue, and 4 medical facilities. Her intelligence gathering has led to the disruption of weapons trafficking networks, the prevention of foreign intelligence operations, and the protection of critical infrastructure. Emma stood suddenly, swaying slightly as the full weight of revelation hit her. "All those times you seemed distant," she said, her voice breaking. "All those dinners you missed, all those conversations where you seemed somewhere else. You were protecting us." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The tears I'd held back for 15 years were threatening to break free as my family finally understood the choice I'd made to let them think less of me so they could live without fear. "The sacrifice has been extraordinary," General Hayes concluded. "Not just in terms of physical danger, but in terms of personal relationships. Agent Mitchell has lived for 15 years with the knowledge that the people she loves most see her as a disappointment because that perception was essential to keeping them safe." The personal journal I'd kept hidden in my apartment for 15 years had been my only companion through the loneliest moments of my service. In its pages, I'd recorded not the details of my missions, those were classified beyond even my own personal records, but the emotional cost of living a life that no one I loved could understand. May 15th. I'd written after missing Emma's birthday dinner 3 years ago. Another family gathering I had to skip because of operational requirements. Emma looked hurt when I called to cancel. Mother made that face, the one that says she's disappointed but not surprised. "They think I don't care enough to prioritize family. If only they knew I care so much that I'm willing to let them hate me to keep them safe." The entries had become increasingly painful over the years, documenting not just my isolation but my growing fear that the sacrifice might not be worth it. November 3rd from 2 years ago, watched the news coverage of the hospital shooting in Denver. 15 dead, including 3 doctors. I knew it was coming, we had intelligence but couldn't act fast enough. Emma doesn't know how close she came to the same fate last month. She'll never know that her safety is purchased with my reputation, her peace with my loneliness. Standing in the cathedral, surrounded by family who finally understood the truth, I thought about the entry I'd written just last week. Emma's wedding is Saturday. I'll sit in the back, smile politely, and deflect questions about my non-existent achievements. Mother will introduce me with that apologetic tone she uses when she's embarrassed by me. I'll watch my sister marry a good man and start a beautiful life. And I'll know that I helped make that life possible. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. But it hadn't been enough. Not really. The loneliness had been crushing at times. The weight of carrying secrets that isolated me from everyone I loved. There had been nights when I'd sat in my apartment, surrounded by commendations I couldn't share and medals I couldn't display, wondering if the price I was paying was too high. The hardest part hadn't been the physical danger of my assignments, though there had been plenty of that. It hadn't been the long hours, the foreign countries, the constant vigilance required to maintain my cover. The hardest part had been coming home to a family that saw me as a failure and having to smile and accept their disappointment. December 25th. From last Christmas, Emma gave her annual speech about my potential, how I could still turn things around if I found the right opportunity. Father nodded along, that patient expression he wears when discussing my career prospects. I wanted to tell them about the Medal of Valor sitting in my safe, about the letter from the president thanking me for preventing a nuclear materials theft. Instead, I promised to update my resume. The journal had been my confession booth, the place where I could acknowledge the full cost of my choices. February 14th. After another failed attempt at a relationship, David asked too many questions. About my work, wanted to know why I traveled so much but never seemed to get promoted. I had to end it. Can't maintain operational security and a normal relationship. Sometimes I wonder if I'll die alone, surrounded by secrets no one can know. Each entry had been a small act of rebellion against the isolation my work required. In those pages, I'd allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd given up. Not just career recognition or financial success, but the simple human pleasure of being known and understood by the people who mattered most. Now, standing before my family as they finally learned the truth, I realized that every lonely night had been preparing me for this moment. Every disappointed look I'd endured had been building toward this revelation. Every sacrifice had led to this instant when the people I loved most could finally see me as I really was. The journal would never record another entry about isolation or misunderstanding. Whatever came next, I would face it as my self-agent Victoria Mitchell, decorated veteran, protector of the innocent, and finally a daughter her family could be proud of. Father McKenna, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout the extraordinary interruption, stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to moments of profound significance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, "we have witnessed something extraordinary today, not just the revelation of heroic service, but the moment when truth replaces misunderstanding." He turned to Emma and David, still standing at the altar in their wedding finery, looking somewhat forgotten amid the dramatic revelations. "Emma, David, your wedding day has been blessed with a reminder of the sacrifices that protect the love you're celebrating. Perhaps Agent Mitchell would join you at the altar where she belongs." General Hayes nodded approvingly. "Agent Mitchell, your service has protected not just your family but thousands of families like yours. It would be our honor to witness this celebration." I walked down the aisle I'd never expected to traverse, past relatives whose expressions had transformed. From pity to awe, Mother reached out to touch my hand as I passed, her fingers trembling with emotion. Father stood as I approached, his eyes bright with unshed tears and newfound pride at the altar. Emma turned to face me fully for the first time since the revelation began. "Victoria," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. All these years I thought exactly what you were supposed to think?" I replied, taking her hands in mine. "Your safety depended on it." The photographer, who had been frozen in confusion since the Joint Chiefs arrived, suddenly came alive with professional instinct. "This is unprecedented," he murmured, raising his camera. "A Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient at a wedding ceremony, this will be historic." But the most meaningful photo was the one he captured next. 3 sisters standing together, Emma in her wedding dress, me in my navy dress with the Presidential Medal of Freedom gleaming against the fabric, and the invisible presence of all the lives we'd both saved in our different ways. General Hayes approached the altar with formal precision. "Dr. Mitchell," she addressed Emma, "Agent Mitchell's work has specifically protected St. Catherine's Hospital on 7 separate occasions. Your ability to save lives has been preserved by your sister's willingness to sacrifice recognition for security." Emma's face crumpled with the weight of that knowledge. "Every patient I've saved was possible because Agent Mitchell ensured you were alive to save them," Admiral Chen confirmed. "Your sister's work has protected not just your life, but every life you've touched in your medical career." The wedding ceremony resumed with an energy and significance that transcended the traditional celebration of 2 people joining their lives. It had become a celebration of service, sacrifice, and the revelation of truth that transforms understanding. When Father McKenna asked if anyone objected to the union, General Thompson spoke with quiet authority on behalf of the United States military. "We offer our blessing to this union. Dr. Mitchell and her future husband are marrying under the protection of freedoms defended by Agent Mitchell's service." The exchange of rings took on deeper meaning as Emma placed the band on David's finger, with hands that had been protected by my vigilance. While David's promise to love and protect Emma was witnessed by the sister who had already been protecting her for 15 years when they kissed as husband and wife, the applause that erupted came not just from wedding guests, but from 3 of the highest-ranking military officers in the country. The sound echoed through the cathedral like a benediction, blessing not just their marriage but the family bonds that had been tested and ultimately strengthened by the revelation of truth. As the wedding party processed back down the aisle, I walked beside Emma and David, no longer the forgotten sister relegated to the back row, but the protector whose sacrifice had made this moment possible. The reception hall buzzed with conversations. Unlike any wedding celebration in memory, guests clustered in small groups, their voices hushed with the weight of what they'd witnessed. The woman they'd pitied for 15 years had been revealed as a decorated hero, and every assumption they'd made about my life had been shattered in a single afternoon. Mother found me first, approaching with the tentative steps of someone afraid to break something precious. In her hand was an envelope, cream-colored and heavy, with my name written in her careful script. "I wrote this last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd planned to give it to you later, to try to encourage you to find something better. Now I realize how foolish that was." I opened the envelope carefully, unfolding pages of her familiar handwriting. The letter began with words that made my throat tight. "My darling Victoria, I've failed you as a mother by not seeing your worth. ... She'd written about her disappointment in my choices, her worry about my future, her hope that I might still find success and recognition. Every line was infused with love, but shadowed by misunderstanding, the misunderstanding I'd carefully cultivated. "To protect her, I know now that you were protecting us," she continued, reading over my shoulder. "That every time we questioned your choices, you were choosing our safety over our approval. I don't know how to apologize for 15 years of not seeing who you really are." I folded the letter carefully and pulled her into my arms. "You loved me even when you thought I was failing," I said. "That's what mattered. That's what gave me strength." Uncle Robert approached us hesitantly, his face etched with shame. "Victoria, I owe you an apology that I'll never be able to make properly. The way I've spoken about your work, the assumptions. I've made you were supposed to make those assumptions," I interrupted gently. "My effectiveness depended on appearing ordinary, unsuccessful. You helped maintain my cover without knowing it." Emma joined us, still in her wedding dress but somehow transformed by the day's revelations. "I've been thinking about all the times you seemed distant," she said. "All the conversations where you seemed to be somewhere else. You were carrying secrets that would have terrified us." David, her new husband, extended his hand with formal respect. "Agent Mitchell," he said, "thank you for protecting the woman I love. I understand now why Emma spoke about you with such affection despite worrying about your circumstances." The conversations continued through the evening, each family member grappling with the reality that their perceptions had been carefully orchestrated illusions. Cousin Patricia apologized for her years of patronizing advice. Aunt Helen wept as she realized her dismissive comments had been directed at a woman risking her life for national security. Great-Aunt Margaret, who'd spent the ceremony in shocked silence, finally approached me near the end of the reception. "I've lived 93 years," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "and I've never been more ashamed of my judgment or more proud of my family. But it was Father's conversation that affected me most deeply." He found me on the terrace outside the reception hall, where I'd stepped away from the overwhelming attention. "I keep thinking about all the times I introduced you as my daughter, who was still finding her way," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "When the truth is, you'd found your way years ago. You'd just found a path I couldn't see." "I wanted to tell you," I said. "Every time you looked disappointed, every time you worried about my future, I wanted to explain. But your safety was more important than your understanding." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the city lights. "I failed as a father by measuring your worth against conventional success. I should have trusted that the daughter I raised would find her own way to make a difference." "You didn't fail," I assured him. "You raised me with values that led me to this work, came from you and Mother." As the evening wound down, I realized that the day had transformed more than just my family's understanding of my life. It had transformed me as well. For 15 years, I'd carried the burden of their disappointment alongside the weight of my responsibilities. Now, finally, I could move forward with their knowledge, their support, and their pride. 3 weeks after Emma's wedding, the assignment was unprecedented, a new position that would allow me to serve openly, to use my experience in ways that could be publicly acknowledged. "The Domestic Threat Assessment Division needs someone with your unique background," General Hayes explained. "Your years of deep cover work have given you insights that can't be learned from textbooks. You'd be training the next generation of intelligence officers while helping develop new protocols for family protection in sensitive operations." The position would mean an end to the shadows, an end to the careful lies and maintained deceptions that had defined my adult life. I would finally be able to have business cards that accurately described my work, to attend conferences where I could share my expertise, to build relationships without the constant worry of maintaining operational security. "What about my family?" I asked. "Will they be safe if my work becomes public?" "The threats you've been monitoring have been neutralized," she assured me. "Your transition to this role has been planned for months, pending the completion of your final classified assignment. Operation Nightingale was your graduation, Agent Mitchell. You've earned the right to step into the light." That evening, I Called a family meeting at my parents' house. They gathered in the living room where I'd once sat as a child, dreaming of making a difference in the world. Now, 34 years old and bearing scars both visible and hidden, I was finally free to share those dreams with the people who mattered most. I'll be working at the Pentagon, training other agents, developing new security protocols. It's work I can finally discuss, achievements I can finally share. Mother's eyes filled with tears of relief and pride. You'll be able to have a normal life, she said. Relationships, friends who know who you really are. I'll be able to introduce you as my daughter, the Pentagon advisor, Father added, his voice warm with anticipation. Emma, who had called every day since her wedding to check on me, leaned forward with interest. Will you move to Washington? Eventually? I confirmed. But I'll have time to transition to help you all adjust to this new reality. And I'll finally be able to tell you about my work, to share the parts of my life that have been locked away for so long. The conversation continued late into the evening, filled with questions I could finally answer and stories I could finally tell. I learned about the languages I spoke, the countries I'd lived in, the operations that had shaped my understanding of global security. Uncle Robert, who had asked to join the family meeting, listened with the fascination of someone discovering that a relative was actually a character from a thriller novel. To think, he said, shaking his head. All these years I was giving career advice to someone who was already at the pinnacle of her profession. The highest levels of government service, I corrected gently. But you were right that I needed to find work that fulfilled me. This new position will let me serve in ways that feel more sustainable, more connected to normal life. As the evening wound down, Emma pulled me aside. I've been thinking about something, she said. All those times you seemed to know exactly what to say when I was stressed about work. When I was dealing with difficult cases, you understood because you were dealing with life and death situations every day. I nodded. Your problems were never small to me. They were precious because they were normal, because they reminded me what I was protecting. I want you to know, she continued, that even when we didn't understand your work, we always knew you were special. Mother used to say that you had an old soul, that you carried yourself like someone who'd seen more of the world than the rest of us. The next morning, I began the process of closing my safe house apartment and preparing for a life where my work and my identity could finally align. The medals would come out of the safe and onto the wall. The commendation letters would be framed. Instead of hidden, the woman my family had worried about would finally become the woman they could openly celebrate 6 months later. I stood in my new office at the Pentagon, looking at the family photo on my desk. Not the old graduation picture that had represented lost potential, but a new one taken at Emma's wedding. In it, I wore my dress blues with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, surrounded by family whose faces glowed with pride and understanding. The transformation had been complete, but gradual. My new role allowed me to serve openly while using the hard-won experience of 15 years in the shadows. I trained other agents in the delicate art of maintaining cover while protecting family relationships. I developed protocols that would prevent future operatives from bearing the isolation I'd carried. Mother called every Sunday now, eager to hear about my work in ways she never had been before. She'd started introducing me at social gatherings as my daughter Victoria, who works in national security at the Pentagon. The pride in her voice made up for 15 years of disappointment. Father had framed my commendation letters and displayed them in his study alongside Emma's medical school diplomas. The wall that had once highlighted only one daughter's achievements now celebrated both of us, the surgeon who saved lives in the emergency room and the agent who protected those who saved lives. Emma and I talked regularly now. Our conversations deepened by mutual understanding of what it meant to serve others. She'd begun working with the hospital's security committee, using her new awareness of potential threats to help protect her colleagues and patients. The extended family had also transformed their understanding. Uncle Robert sent me articles about intelligence work, finally grasping the significance of what I'd been doing. Cousin Patricia had stopped offering career advice and started asking thoughtful questions about international security. But the most meaningful change was in how I saw myself. For 15 years, I'd defined my worth through sacrifice and secrecy. Now I was learning to value service that could be acknowledged, relationships that could be honest, achievements that could be shared. The young agents I trained reminded me why the work mattered. They came to the program with the same idealism. I'd once carried the same willingness to serve something greater than themselves. My job was to ensure they could maintain that service without losing themselves in the process. The goal, I told my latest class of trainees, is to protect others without sacrificing your own humanity. You can serve your country without becoming invisible to your family. The best intelligence officers are those who remember why civilian life is worth protecting. On quiet evenings, I sometimes pulled out my old journal and read the entries from my years in the shadows. They served as reminders of the price of secrecy, but also of the strength that comes from choosing duty over recognition. I'd kept those lessons while learning new ones about the value of being known and understood. The woman who had sat in the back row at her sister's wedding, carrying secrets that isolated her from everyone she loved, had evolved into someone who could serve openly while maintaining the bonds that made service meaningful. The sacrifice had been real, but so was the redemption. Truth, I'd learned, doesn't always arrive as dramatically as it had that day in the cathedral. Usually, it comes quietly in moments of understanding between people who love each other. But sometimes when the stakes are high enough and the service has been profound enough, truth arrives with the weight of authority and the recognition of a grateful nation. I'd spent 15 years protecting my family's ability to live normal lives. Now, finally, I was learning to live one myself.